You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your historical host, Abraham.
And I'll be your philosophical host, Shane.
We are a psychology podcast. We talk all things psychology and human behavior, interaction, sort of things. And today we're doing a history piece. We're digging into the archives of psychology history.
Yeah, and so we do enjoy a good history dive every now and again. So, you can go back and reference we did the episode on syphilis and we did the one on lobotomies and stuff. And so, every now and again in the Donner Party, that was a fun one.
Deinstitutionalizing the mental health institutions.
That was a fun one. Yeah, we did a lot of deep dives. This one we're really excited about because this is kind of a pivotal moment for psychology. So we're really excited to get into this particular character.
This is like a biopic, except it's a biopod.
I like that.
Yeah. Oh, and we did this also with Pavlov.
Yeah, we did do Pavlov.
Yeah.
I forgot about that.
We've got so much good history.
A lot of dog spit in that one.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Like right inside your mouth. I mean, we've actually done several, and it's not worth listening to them all here, although I think it is worth eventually curating sort of a playlist of history, because there's a lot, and I personally love history, so I think that's really fun. And hey, if you are interested in what we have to say about this or other topics and would like to hear more from what we have going on, you can always visit us at our website at www.podcast.com. Also, our episodes have like bonus content and stuff that you could get access to if you want to join us on Patreon. We'll shout you out for being an awesome person and helping us do our thing. You'll also get early releases, all kinds of bonus stuff. You can head over there.
Yeah.
But if you don't want to support us that way, but you're still like, yes, this podcast is the bee's knees, then you can always leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And we also appreciate that.
Yeah, we love feedback. So give us feedback. Tell us what we're doing well. Tell us what we're doing wrong. We're totally good with that.
Perfect. Now, let's go ahead and get into our subject today, because we're talking about someone who has sometimes been dubbed the father of modern psychology. Maybe a title that not everyone agrees with, and maybe not even relevant anymore, but that's a title that he once held, which means, of course, we're talking about the man himself, Billy the James.
Good old Billy Jimmy.
Yep. Or better known, William James.
Yeah, William James. That's the name that we're covering. So in order to get into this particular topic about William James and kind of the influence that he had on psychology, we should first probably get into the James family. So where in the world is William James? Well, according to his own logic and theory, not in the afterlife, no RSVP at the pearly gates of heaven, and he's not taking a hot seat at the place below. Okay, so we at least know that about him.
Just dead and gone. So again, the title father of psychology is maybe not one that everyone would agree with. During the time of the educational revolution, there were very select individuals that were quote unquote allowed in the educational academic lecture sort of arenas. And his contributions to psychology, they were very strong. However, thinking of something as the father, and like I'm thinking of this as this sort of like asexual progenitor sort of thing, because it's not like a mother of psychology, right? That way is very heavy. And I also think that, those who are not allowed into that arena for various reasons, because they were women, because they were people of color, because they come from other cultures or spoke other languages, that sort of thing, it makes it seem like their contributions just aren't as important, and they were. So worth, I think, acknowledging that William James did have some really cool contributions, and we don't want to overshadow the other people who have led contributions or who have made significant contributions. So we'll just call him an important historical figure in the history of psychology.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, in the absence of equity, we can't say that anybody is the father of anything, really.
Except for the father of Shane.
Except for, Tom Spiker. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a step back and we're going to learn more about the family tree of the Jameses, because as you will come to learn, William comes to question capital G God and starts looking at a more pragmatic view of the world that was coming. So he starts kind of looking at a different way to approach all these things. Also, having some substantial financial resources was truly life-changing. That little loan of $1 million can be, quite a game changer for people.
Mr. James here was born to a rather large family, and there may have potentially been some sort of brotherly rivalry going on here. Spoiler alert, Henry James Jr. was possibly the family favorite, as he, again, Henry James Jr., was stated as an author among the greatest novelists in the English language, who was also nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1911, 1912, and 1916. So got a lot of attention in the spotlight.
So let's start with William's grandfather, and buckle up. You're going to hear the name James a whole lot. This is William James. He's the grandfather. So William James, grandfather, was born in 1771 and later died in 1832 at the age of 61, which is pretty impressive for that time period. People did not live that long.
That's not bad.
So William's grandfather was an immigrant from Baileyborough.
I'm thinking maybe Baileyborough.
Baileyborough?
Oh wait, this is Ireland. That's probably pronounced like Scottsdale or something.
Steve.
Yeah, it's pronounced Steve. It's pronounced O'Reilly.
Yeah, you know, Gaelic is such this is not written in Gaelic, but I have tried to study Gaelic, and I always go back to Sean, right? So the word, the name Sean, Sean, is pronounced S-H-A. So,
or Siobhan, which has like not the right letters at all to be pronounced that way.
You know how many times I would see that name from people, and I'm like, that says Siobhan.
Right.
And no, it says Siobhan. So anyway, he was an immigrant from, we'll say, Baileyborough, County Cavan in Ireland, to the United States around 1789. So William James, the grandfather, had amassed a fortune of about $1.2 million from a business dealing in upstate New York State, primarily in Albany in that real estate area, where he was money lending, and his involvement in the building of the Erie Canal. So he had some pretty lucrative business offerings that afforded him a nice, comfy lifestyle.
And as a quick frame of reference, so this is $1.2 million. Again, this is late 1700s, early 1800s money we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
In 1789, that's the equivalent in purchasing power of about $38 million in today dollars, which is an increase of $36 million over 233 years. The dollar has an average inflation rate of 1.49% per year between 1789 and today, producing, again, a total cumulative price increase of 3,068.2%.
Hell of an increase.
Yeah. That's the kind of investment you want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Not that you'll live to see it.
No.
William James, the grandfather, is nowhere around. Now, there is the father, Henry James Sr., William's father. He was born on June 3rd, 1811 in Albany, New York. And Henry James Sr., the father, revolted against Calvinism and felt that the social order was unjust. A fire accident that happened to him as a schoolboy around the age of 13, resulting in the amputation of a leg, drove him further upon his mental resources. And so, however, an inheritance from his father, William James, the grandfather, a dominant figure in upstate New York real estate, they provided him a lifelong income. So grandfather gives senior a lot of money, and it helped out.
All right, so I think, to try and just get through the remaining relevant parts of this for family history stuff, William James' dad, he graduated from Union College in 1830, entered Princeton Theological Seminary in 1835, but withdrew after 2 years, finding himself out of sympathy with the Orthodox theology. And this is something I think that's very thematic that we'll see. Religion was just the sort of common battleground for this family and for William James in particular throughout a lot of their history, where they kind of moved in and out. It seems like, based on what we saw here, that they kind of moved in and out of these different religions. They would sometimes rebel, or like they would find themselves in the midst of a religion or learn about it and get into it and then feel like this is just not for me. And so there was a lot of mixed feelings about the varieties of religious experience, which will come up later.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, on a visit to England in 1837, he became influenced. This is senior. Yeah. He became influenced by Robert Sandeman, a Scottish opponent of Calvinism, one of whose books he edited in 1838. During the 1840s and 1850s, James lived in New York and traveled abroad frequently until 1864, he settled in Boston. That's spelled Bawston. Boston.
Boston.
Yeah, Boston. So in the 1840s, he was introduced to the doctrines of Swedenborg and underwent a kind of religious conversion. Again, kind of going to the idea of like kind of exploring and discovering these different religious practices.
Yeah.
And although he never literally embraced these doctrines, they affected his whole later thought and gave him a strong mystical bias, which is really interesting when we get into some of the philosophy that we're going to talk about. He's a friend of Emerson and Carlyle and frequently lectured on them.
Most of his writings were, again, devoted to this expressing of this religious doctrine. So he sort of moved out of these different religions. He found this one that he liked, the immanence of God and the unity of mankind. And he also wrote these books, Christianity and the Logic of Creation, Substance and Shadow, The Morality. There's like a lot. The Secret of Swedenborg Society, The Redeemed Form of Man. These titles are sort of long, so I'm reading a truncated version of them. But that's some of his scholarly, if you will, religious writings. And this is, again, we're still talking about William James' father.
This is my new favorite game. Is it a Norma Jean song title or a William James Sr. book? Society, the Redeemed Form of Man, and the Earnest of God's Omnipotence in Human Nature. Is it? Is that from Kiss the Martyr, Bless the Child, or is that William James Sr.?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So to wrap up what we talked about, William James was the grandson of Irish immigrants or migrants.
Or Imishes.
Henry James Sr. was one of 12 or 13 children, inherited wealth from William James' grandfather. So there's a lot of stuff there. And so now we're going to kind of talk about some experiences with William James. William James Jr. even.
All right. So just some quick fun tidbits about Harvard, because we can.
Harvard.
That's right. Now, Harvard first started admitting students in 1636. And so in 1636, you definitely know what those students looked like. There was a lot of black women. Just kidding.
Definitely not.
It was 100% only white males, and pretty safe to say that it was really only, I think, in the elite class stratus, white males.
Mm-hmm.
Over 200 years later, in 1870, Harvard graduates its first black male student. Actually, that's not bad given the time frame that they were in. Obviously, it would have been better if this was more equitable to begin with, but there it is. And this is Richard Theodore Greener, who went on to a career to be an educator and lawyer. And after graduating from Harvard, Greener also became faculty member at the University of South Carolina.
Richard T. Greener was the first BIPOC person to enter the college and to complete the undergraduate curriculum with an AB in 1870. So, quote, winning the chief prizes in writing and speaking along the way, end quote. He was not, however, the first BIPOC person to be admitted, a distinction belonging to Beverly Garnett Williams in 1847. And he died just before the academic year began and thus never entered college. Beverly Garnett Williams had passed away before entering the school. So interesting kind of little tidbits about that particular era.
Now, Harvard Graduate School of Education was the first to admit women in 1920. But of course, important caveat there, this is white women and not women of color. One drop rule. The Harvard Medical School accepted its first female enrollees in 1945, although women had first applied almost 100 years earlier in 1847. So 1 century later, victory.
Progress is slow, I guess.
Now, when, Shane, can we expect that the first African-American woman was able to attend Harvard? It had to be around like the early 1900s, right?
Yeah, of course. Or no African-American female attended Harvard until Harvard and Radcliffe merged in 1977.
Wow.
Yes. This is wild to think about. Although Alberta versus Scott was the first black woman to graduate from Radcliffe in 1898. So Radcliffe had some black women who had graduated, but Harvard, not so much. Not till 1977, which means that my parents were already alive at that point in time. My dad was a teenager before that happened.
Yeah, that was actually less than a decade before both of us would be born.
Yeah, yes.
So
it's wild to think.
That seems way too late in the game.
Yeah. Anytime we talk about history, I think this is really important to remember, is that so many of these major milestones that happened in the United States that go back and reference, people are like, oh, well, slavery was not so far away. It wasn't that far away. It's only like 1 or 2 generations removed, truly.
Yeah.
When you get into all of this stuff. I mean, this happened in my parents' lifetime.
Another frame of reference, because we posted about it this month in celebration of Black History Month, the first African-American female astronaut in space. Okay, so NASA's been doing its thing for like decades, right? A really long time. We started sending people up into outer space and like, I think the 1950s, maybe somewhere in that ballpark. I'm sorry. I know people are going to be screaming at their stereo because they know this timeline better than I do, but let's say around then. Okay. And then we have people who, we're finally admitting African-American women to colleges and they're getting advanced degrees and we're starting to elevate people a little bit further. What year is the first African-American woman finally make it into space? 1992. 1992.
That's just wild.
that was, I mean, relatively speaking, so recently.
Yeah.
So I don't know, just a thing, just throwing it out there.
In our lifetime.
Yeah. Like we were already like running around causing chaos. I think that was the year Jurassic Park maybe came out, just to put it in reference.
I think that was 94, but it's close. It was close.
Okay.
It was the year after Nirvana's Nevermind came out.
Okay. Very important. Also, like, this is like season 3 of The Simpsons, maybe something like that.
Right? Yeah. I was just thinking, like, so I just looked it up. 1977 was the first black woman to graduate from Harvard. 1976 was the first Ramones record to come out.
Okay. Wow.
So Blitzkrieg Bop happened before this woman graduated Harvard.
Blitzkrieg Baby. That was a
Blitzkrieg Baby.
That's what we're talking about with you. Oh, yeah. So actually, now that I think about it, I wasn't even putting 2 and 2 together, but that was 30 years ago, was the first African-American woman in space.
So wild. So with all that being said, let's talk about the man of the hour, Will James. Oh, Billy Jimmy. Billy Jilly, I almost called him.
Billy Jilly. Before we talk about Billy Jilly, we actually need to take a quick break for some advertisements. We'll be right back. All right, so we just finished both celebrating and ragging on Harvard and the American education system and celebrating the history of excellent and amazing African-American people. And so now we get to talk about Billy Jilly.
Yes, let's talk about William James. So William James was born in 1842 and passed away or died in 1910, if we're not going to use euphemisms. And in typical Wikipedia fashion, he was a delightful overachiever, American philosopher, psychologist, proponent of pragmatism, and, quote, a founder of the psychological movement known as functionalism, end quote, often listed as the father of American psychology, which we already dove into that. So this is where we're going. We're going to talk about all the stuff that William James did in his lifetime.
Okay, so this is all going to be important, and I think understanding his philosophy is just talking through sort of his history and his education and that sort of thing. First, to understand is he had Renaissance man all over the place, educated in New York, France, Switzerland. As we mentioned, his father was pretty well educated, went through a lot of different experiences, particularly with religion, and he was influenced heavily, as you might imagine, by his father's sympathetic but critical way of thinking, and there was a lot of philosophy and theology and ideology that his father brought to and influenced in him raising his children, particularly in this case, we're talking about obviously William.
Yeah. Now, he attended the Lawrence Scientific School of Harvard University, which is America's favorite backup school, and he took classes in chemistry, anatomy, and moved to Harvard Medical School, but interrupted that pursuit several times with various big names and projects, including one, going to the Amazon with Louis Agassiz, an esteemed naturalist.
He went to Germany to study with physicist and physiologist Hermann von Helmholtz, famous for the law of conservation of energy. Hopefully several people have heard that name before.
He hung out with Rudolf Virchow, who's a pathologist.
He hung out with Claude Bernard, the foremost experimentalist of 19th century medicine.
And he was also inspired by Charles Renouvier. That's how I would imagine pronouncing that.
Me too.
Who was influenced by Kant, who's a philosopher that I learned about in my philosophy class. In college, my philosophy teacher could not pronounce Kant, and he said it in a way that was real problematic. So, as you can imagine.
Oh, no. Yeah. Quick vowel substitution there makes that pretty problematic pretty quickly.
Yeah,
but
yep.
Continuing on with James, important to understand about James also in the context of in which he was growing up and experiencing the world is he actually had a lot of health issues. He had some heart issues. He suffered from depression, and these really interrupted a lot of his goings on in life. He had other ailments. As a matter of fact, he even espoused, or maybe disclosed is a better way of describing this, having suicidal thoughts while he was living in Germany. By the time he acquired his MD from Harvard Medical School in 1869, he could not begin practicing. He sought exile in his father's house for 3 years until 1872, where he obsessively was reading and writing, his philosophy and ideas.
Yeah, and so this heart issue had plagued him around the turn of the 20th century, and he ended up in Europe for nearly 2 years, incapacitated while prepping for religious lectures at the University of Edinburgh. I would imagine that if he's put up and he can't really do a whole lot, the best thing he could do was read and write. So it's likely that he probably read every book that he could get his hands on.
At the end of this discussion, we're going to actually dig in a lot more on the philosophy and things that he brought to the table. But while in his early philosophy, while he was in isolation, he embraced the writings of the Renouvier on free will and instead rejected this idea of deterministic thinking, although, as we'll see, his attitudes did shift quite a bit on various aspects of his philosophy later in life.
Yeah, so as a professional, he was appointed from 1872 to 1876. He was appointed as the instructor of physiology at Harvard College, and he quickly transitioned to teaching what Britannica.com describes as, quote, physiological psychology, not mental philosophy, but a laboratory science, end quote. And you will kind of feel a little bit, that sounds very Pavlovian.
Yeah.
Where Pavlov was kind of in the same space, right? Like he was working as a physiologist.
And the same time.
So, maybe they influence each other a little bit.
Apparently, according to verywellmind.com, he was the first to teach a psychology course in the United States. So there's that.
Yeah.
His neurasthenia issues seemed to decrease shortly after he married Alice H. Gibbons in 1878. So marriage was apparently good for him. His energy and dedication to his work became more focused and less disrupted by his various issues, including his mental issues like depression.
Hearing the word neurasthenia immediately gave me the image of like a black metal band's logo. Like this would be a really great black metal band's logo, or like a name for a black metal band. It's like all the like the branches and like that you can't read.
I could very much see that, but I could also really see this being like this sort of almost psychedelic funk group, having sort of like, I see the big 70s letters like neurasthenia. I don't know.
I could see that. They tour with the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Sure.
So William James has a few masterworks that are worth talking about. So the first is The Principles of Psychology in 1890. It was commissioned in 1880 as a textbook for psychology, and it established a functional point of view in psychology. So this is kind of the beginnings of his functionalism dive as we go forward.
Now, he also was sort of loosely defending free will here, and according to Britannica, quote, assimilated mental sciences into the biological disciplines and treated thinking and knowledge as instruments in the struggle to live. And so sort of trying to, I think, tether it to reality as much as possible.
He also published the Varieties of Religious Experience in 1902, a combination of the University of Edinburgh lectures on religion. And what he did was he claimed that religious experience points to the existence of, quote, reservoirs of consciousness like energies with which we can make specific contact in times of trouble, end quote. And he added Mother Mary and some other words of wisdom. And I think James might have beaten McCartney to Let It Be by about 65 years. So he's he was on a path. He's really the father of modern Beatles.
I had the urge to try and sing the Reservoirs of Consciousness in the melody of Let It Be. But I decided
Reservoirs of consciousness, like energies with which we can.
Yes. Thank you. Another very seminal piece of work that he wrote, which is actually the only book of his that I've ever read cover to cover, is Pragmatism, A New Name for Old Ways of Thinking in 1907. And it actually was less of like a sort of formal book than it was a collection of lectures in Boston that were essentially written up. And so if you do read this, you will notice some overlap in some of the things that are discussed across the various chapters or sections of the book. But this implied that, quote, the relations between things, holding them together or separating them, are at least as real as the things themselves, that their function is real, and that no hidden substrata are necessary to account for the clashes and coherences of the world, end quote. And we'll dig into his specific philosophies in just a moment here. But I think that there's a lot to understand in what pragmatism is, what it means, and how that sentiment that I just mentioned really conveys his position with respect to functionalism and pragmatism, and this idea that it's not this linear like this then this, right? It's this interactive piece. It's the space between events and how they relate to one another that was important. And then the fact that pragmatism is also a way of viewing sort of truth. And maybe I'm getting ahead a little bit. So we should actually touch on philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of what William James contributed to the world of psychology was the philosophical approaches that we're going to cover. So the first one is this. He basically saw a philosophical kind of shift away from the principles of psychology that he'd written before. He shifted away from the topics that he touched upon in Principles of Psychology, disliking laboratory work. And he much preferred the adventure, quote, the adventure of free observation and reflection, end quote, which sounds very psychological on its surface, right? It sounds like that is like what the majority of psychologists at the time were doing. So it made sense. Yeah.
And his interest moved to the quote, nature and existence of God, the immortality of the soul, free will, and determinism, the values of life. And so between 1893 and 1903, He composed essays and lectures related to topics such as this idea of free will, this idea of determinism, existentialism, ethics, religion. As we mentioned at the top, he was a big philosophy guy. So a lot of this was just around this is big philosophizing that he's doing. That's a good t-shirt. Big philosophizing.
Yeah, and there's a famous James quote that says, quote, "The art of being wise is the art of knowing what to overlook," end quote. And that's from verywellmind.com. And I think that's a really great way to look at kind of how intelligence might work, right? Like, we know what data is useful, what's not useful, how to interpret those data, how to bring, phenomenon into a space where it's actually useful, and we can overlook kind of the minutia in those spaces. And I think that's a really great way to kind of approach any of this type of practice.
And unfortunately, that quote was, I think, adopted and sort of bastardized by right-wing media, that they turned it into the art of influencing your audience is the art of knowing what to overlook.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's a bummer. It's a real bummer.
So we've been talking about his philosophy, and now it's time, I think, to probably unpack what do we mean by pragmatism. And we'll do that right after we come back from a word from the people who pay for ad space on this episode. Okay, so we were just talking about the philosophy of William James. So let's unpack pragmatism and what that is and how it sort of works, because I found this whole idea for myself extremely compelling. I mean, both that it made a lot of sense to me, as well as the fact that I think it was so unique at the time. At least the way that he portrayed it, I think really was heavily influential on a lot of other things. And I think also understanding that this was also inspired by evolutionary theory proposed by Darwin, as was functionalism, which we'll get to in a moment. Anyway, So he formed this theory of pragmatism in 1898, which he presented in a lecture at the University of California, and described it as, quote, "The meaning of any idea whatsoever, scientific, religious, philosophical, political, social, personal, can be found ultimately in the succession of experiential consequences that leads through and to." And maybe that sounds a little ambiguous, so we'll unpack it a little bit further and see if that helps.
Yeah, so a formal definition would be that, quote, "truth of an idea can never be proven," end quote. And so instead, what we can focus on is the cash value or the usefulness of an idea or its practical use. Essentially, what we're saying is pragmatism just means the thing that we're doing, does it have value? Does it work?
Yes.
And that's really what he's trying to get at the core of this. Now, he applied the pragmatic frame to change and chance, freedom, variety, pluralism, and novelty. And so he's really, again, we talked about him being a philosopher, very much so how Skinner would be like, apply behaviorism to literally everything.
Yeah.
William James did that with pragmatism. Apply it to literally every concept, and you'll see kind of how it emerges.
And honestly, they kind of evolved, Skinner's philosophy, Watson's philosophy, even Pavlov, they kind of evolved all along the same trajectory here, kind of both convergent paths of evolution, as well as one influencing another in many ways. So religion, for instance, we're talking about James here, William James, the man of the hour. Yeah. Religion mattered less about being truer than someone else's religion. Like, it wasn't about like this religion is more true than another religion, but instead rather how it benefited an individual to operate within their ideology, their moral code. And then this is why he had this focus on religious experience rather than the pursuit of concrete facts about a religion, particularly trying to like justify a religion by turning to historical facts.
And I really like this idea because it does focus on individual experiences and kind of those unique contexts in which does it help this person. And another kind of thing that he kind of pulled out of this is this idea of the block universe. And so there's a belief that reality in general is one piece and it rejects absolutes. So essentially that goes back to the idea that like there is no end answer or no truth. There's always kind of new discovery and new experiences. And really with this idea of block universe, there has to be something about we're never going to find the truth, but we will always find what we're using or what we're doing useful, at least to some degree, until something more useful comes along.
Exactly. Yeah. It's whatever it sort of is the most useful. And this flexible ideology this philosophy of pragmatism, because it is flexible, because it sort of follows in line with the idea of sort of natural selection and evolution. It was adopted by many professionals across the world, in the United States, in England, in China, etc. And again, I want to make sure we hit on the point really clearly about pragmatism as the idea of effective working, right? And so let's go with the idea of Tolman's cognitive maps. Okay. We did an episode about this a long time ago. Another one in the history suite, actually.
Yeah.
And so this is the idea that there's this latent learning. And now this has not gone away, but it was a little more popular, I think, back in the day. And this was demonstrated by putting rats in a maze. There was no external reward for them navigating that maze, but just letting them wander around that maze for a while. And then if you did put a piece of food at the end of the maze, they would be able to quickly navigate to that food without having a lot of sort of false starts. So it's how long did it take them to get there? And the group that just sort of wandered around the maze would get there, even though they'd had no formal reward or training on it. It was just from wandering around. And so he was like, well, how do we account for this? It must be these cognitive maps. They have a map in their mind of the space they've been wandering. Okay. Why I mention this is because with respect to pragmatism, does the idea of cognitive maps, it doesn't matter if it's true or false. What matters is that an effective hypothesis? Can we then use that to understand something else? Can we use that to predict what something will do? Can we experimentally manipulate it so that we can show the parameters of how effective this is? And ultimately, I think it's not very pragmatic because we can't do most of those things, but that is an idea. And another one, just to throw it out there because we've done this before, is the idea of consciousness. Can we use that idea in a way to be useful in psychology? And since nobody can define it, I would argue we cannot. I would argue that it has very little pragmatic value because nobody has any idea what they're looking for.
Right.
Like everyone defines it differently. So it's sort of like you define it as whatever you want, right? And ultimately what you're going to find is whatever you've defined it as. And so I think that concept has very little pragmatic value. Ultimately, the definition people land on will have pragmatic value because it'll be the thing that they actually use.
Also looking at those concepts in different spaces, like, I feel like consciousness means something different in a medical space and probably has pragmatic value in that if your patient is conscious, then you can actually implement some kind of medical procedure or get consent or do something, right? So very good point. So I think that is where these definitions come into play and where pragmatism still comes down to the usefulness of whatever it is for that individual experience. Also understanding that might be useful during this time frame and may change later.
That was such a great example. Yes, you're exactly right. That the context of using it actually is critically important in determining whether or not it will be pragmatic.
Yeah.
And I think in the space that you just cited, that's a really good one. So let's now talk a little bit about this other, again, he's sort of credited as being the founder of this philosophy of functionalism.
Yeah. So functionalism opposed structuralist focuses on introspection and broke down mental events into smaller elements, which is a really big deal. This is where, you have the mind-body problem. And he's saying, no, we're going to break that up because the mind is too complex to look at. We're going to look at the actual outcomes. And what James focused on was the, quote, wholeness of an event taken into the impact of the environment on behavior, end quote. Oh, do I love that.
Yeah.
Do I love that so much?
Yeah, right.
Because it talks about, again, individual experiences and how that it talks about context.
Right. So yeah, the structuralist opinion was there is an atom of mental event. If we get small enough, we can find the smallest unit of mental event, and that is what psychology aims to do. And James sort of said, I don't think that's true. I don't think that you can just keep breaking mental events down into smaller and smaller pieces and discover the truth of psychology. Psychology is going to be found in the context in which things interact. And so how mental activity, for example, perception, memory, feeling, and emotion, how that serves an organism is how it serves it to adapt to its environment. Perhaps, again, an early influence on ontogenic and phylogenetic behavior and understanding the evolutionary context in which these behaviors adapted. And so it links back to the idea of sort of natural selection. It is how well does this behavior interact with its environment that selects that behavior to either continue or not. And so again, we see the seeds of what would eventually become one of the most powerful and most widespread philosophies in psychology ever later on.
Isn't it interesting that it took decades for a practical application of functionalism to enter behavior analysis? Like, I think of this like from the space of, Skinner was talking about this, and there is that functional approach and functional effects and all that, but then you get into like the actual treatment and application and applied behavior analysis, and that wasn't until like the 80s where like functional behavior assessments were used.
I mean, the philosophy was kind of always there. Like, I think Watson was almost there, and that there were people who essentially they were thinking of behavior always as the interaction. But yeah, you're right. In terms of looking at behavior in terms of its function and looking at behavior and environment functional relations, that didn't come out until, there's like a century later from this work.
Yeah.
Right?
It's wild. So, the emphasis was on purpose and individual differences, which was really important, right? Like that contextual piece was it really mattered. And perhaps influencing the function in single subject designs later on, like those different types of studies that are done in like when you look at functional relations, like Abraham just mentioned, and how things work together when we looked at causality, all of those things really have roots in this functionalism approach, which is pretty astounding. Like that he came up with it like nearly 100, like so long ago, and it's like really taking hold.
Yeah. Now, he also was one of the very first to even really talk about the environment as a relevant variable in understanding behavior. And so we did this whole episode a while back talking about this idea of shell shock, right? And this was talking about, shell shock was part of it. It wasn't the whole episode topic, but the idea that before there was a clear understanding of the fact that the environment wasn't a relevant factor is that people thought that the only thing that influenced your psychology was impact to your biology or basically your genetic makeup, who you were. And so he was describing this way before that was a thing, like decades before. But again, he was really a philosopher. He was writing about this from the position of like, logically, how do we think about psychology? So he was sort of this logician, if you will, of the science of psychology. And for that reason, he was criticized by other, what might be called psychologists like Wilhelm Wundt, who actually I think had a lot of really interesting things to say. And I'd love to dig into him on another point, but he was a structuralist. And so he was thinking like there are atoms of psychology we need to find. And so he was criticizing William James as writing literature, not psychology. He's like, he's just a philosopher. He's just like thinking of things and writing them down. This isn't science. Science is like measuring atomic mental events, which of course don't exist. He was measuring nothing, but that was a criticism that was leveled at him from that perspective, the structuralist perspective.
Honestly, that makes sense when you have William James, who is openly critical about the experimental side of he didn't like to work in labs. He liked more of the conceptual stuff. So, but there is like a nice marriage in any sort of good science of conceptual philosophy type of stuff and experimental research to back it up. Like that's what you'll see in a lot of sciences, is that there is like usually the conceptual part informs the experimental part, and you get some really cool applications.
Absolutely. And actually, that's a great segue. We're going to talk more about that and how it relates to emotion specifically after we pause for a second to let people do things to you with your money. Okay, so the advertisement space has molested your ears, but we're back. We're back to save you and talk about the James Lange theory of emotion.
So this theory of emotion proposes, and this is a direct quote, proposes that an event triggers a physiological reaction, which we then interpret, end quote. Essentially, emotions are then caused by said interpretation. So we context some event, it triggers some kind of physiological reaction, and then we interpret whatever that reaction is. So if something makes me excited, I feel something in my stomach, I interpret that as feeling excited. Or, what we realize is that being excited and being nervous are literally the same physiological reactions. So it's just how we interpret it in the context.
There's a common story that I don't know if it's apocryphal or not. I don't recall that William James, again, may or may not have said this, that we don't run from a bear because we are scared. We are scared because we run from the bear. It's something like that. And so the idea being that we, just as you said, we have the experience and then we interpret that experience as having a particular meaning, but that comes from the context of the experience itself, not from the feeling. And partially because feelings can be very similar, both physiologically and emotionally, but what they mean to us is different depending on the context. And so how we interpret those emotions, I think, was the argument he's making here, is a critical piece of an understanding why we feel the things that we feel in certain situations.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Massachusetts School of Professional Psychology, which was founded in 1974, changed its name in 2014 to the William James College to honor who they considered a, quote, good icon and brand leader, end quote. Weird that they're talking about brands back then. In short, William James was the equivalent of an Instagram influencer for psychology. He didn't even need the TikTok to make it happen. So he did a great job of kind of being that person at the time that he was around.
It went viral before the smallpox went viral.
You know?
Just kidding. William James was, as we mentioned, he got married, which means that he had some offspring, and James' great-grandson, Jonathan James, so they did not stick with the William James forever. It mentioned that amidst big names in psychology like Rogers, Skinner, Adler, and Jung, quote, people don't know what niche to put and what niche to put William James here, end quote. I was actually not a direct quote because I butchered it, but it was along those lines. He kind of was this Renaissance person. He fit into so many categories. He did so many things, and there was not really a clear place to put him. And I think that's okay. Honestly, I think it's totally fine. It's kind of fun actually to have someone who we don't need the category really. All we need to do is recognize what he did and the historical context in which he did it, and appreciate what we learned from that philosophy.
Yeah, I think the concept of pragmatism specifically is just a really great philosophy of science.
Yes.
It doesn't necessarily have to be a psychology philosophy, but it's a really good philosophy of just approaching science in general, which is like with, what works now will work now and it should benefit the person. But if it no longer benefits the person, then we need to do something different.
I could probably, if I wanted to, sit down and come up with some really good examples, and I should, but I'm not gonna, of even looking at things like medicine, like scientific medicine, and looking at the pragmatic value of something as it exists in those spaces. But any science at all, any material science, I think astronomy and physics, and all of them have elements of like, is this a useful idea? And I think everyone is, or not everyone, but almost everyone is more or less oriented now to that sort of way of thinking about it, is like, does this predict something? Does this inform something? Does this help us in some way? And so it's true in the extent to which it allows us to be effective at what we're doing.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you nailed it.
And so I think that kind of kicks off our take-home points, which was not intentional, but here we are. Let's go ahead and just get in some take-home points about this person.
Yeah, so there's a long list of people who are influenced by William James. That includes people like Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, Edward Thorndike, Mary Whiton Calkins, G. Stanley Hall, Teddy Roosevelt, and Danish quantum physicist Niels Bohr. James's philosophy had revolved and interconnected with these world events. It had done all these things to kind of pull this together, and these relationships between variables, they perpetuated by laws, they, quote, transformed by breaks, spontaneities, and freedoms, end quote. This philosophy really impacted so many more people than just the field of psychology, and I think that's one of the reasons why he was considered such an important figure from psychology, even though he was really an important figure for science.
Apparently, this is more of an interesting tidbit that made its way into take-home points somehow. Apparently, William James also coined the term stream of consciousness, of which our podcast has sometimes been accused.
Yeah, a little bit.
And I think could accurately describe some performances of slam poetry, but essentially saying that everything flows. And I think that that's a really, I think it's an interesting piece. But anyway, I think really getting into an actual take-home point is recognizing that James' overall beliefs and practices were really nuanced, and they really were not easily categorized in any particular way that is like, as we understand these categories to exist in retrospect today. But his legacy is rather one of sort of influence to the overall, I think, philosophy of science and particularly of psychology, and contributing an organized system to replicate and practice and sort of just provide a guiding framework by which psychologists can continue to move forward with both their philosophy and subsequently, and based on that philosophy, their application to real world situations and problems and like therapies and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. And then finally, the idea of pragmatism. When we've kind of talked about this at length, but the argument is that many attempts to break down everything for deeper truth is futile. It's a doomed pursuit because there's always going to be something smaller that you look at. Rather, what we should look at is if we're better off for looking at the utility of our tools and our methods, whether or not that thing works or it doesn't work, and how they function to improve our scientific inquiries and our overall effectiveness in whatever we're trying to do. This pragmatism piece is so critically important for understanding and improving sciences that if we didn't have it, we would still be using lobotomies today. We would still be using really problematic interventions well into the future, because what we're finding is things were working but not working for that person.
Yeah, and I think to say it another way is that we want our science and our application of science to be guided by what works and not by ideology. When ideology guides things, it breaks apart, and then you do things that don't work. And we see that in, I think, the sort of conspiracy theorist movements that are out there. Mm-hmm. Like, these are philosophies that are guided by ideology and the opposite of what works a lot of the time.
Yeah.
It's a very easy, I think, position to adopt. And I'm going to say back something you had said earlier, which I really liked, which is the idea that pragmatism is the truth of an idea is how well that idea works, is how effective it is, the utility that it provides. I said that much worse than you did before, but that's the sort of take home point, I think.
I thought you said it better than I did. So,
well, thanks. That more or less wraps up what we have to say on William James. It was a fun deep dive, and I think useful to understand. And there's obviously more, but I would certainly encourage you, if you want to learn more about William James, go pick up one of his books. Like I said, I read Pragmatism, and I liked that book. It was a collection of sort of those lectures, but I found a lot of really great quotes in there. This is obviously over a century old at this point, so it might not be the easiest read, mostly just because the language that's used does not flow in the cadence that we're used to in more contemporary Americanese. Mm-hmm. But I do recommend picking those up, particularly if you're interested in them. And then I do have the varieties of religious experience. I've just never sat down and actually read it. So I'll get to that at some point. In the meantime, let's go ahead and get to a little piece of listener mail. Okay, this comes from Celeste, and Celeste actually wrote us back shortly after we'd published our episode on calendars, and I just forgot to include it. So I apologize for my delay on this, Celeste, but we had inquired during the episode if we were to adopt a 13-month calendar instead of our current 12-month calendar, what should we call the 13th month? And we asked for some suggestions, and Celeste wrote in with one, which was great. And so she said, "Hello all, I was trying to think of a clever name for the proposed 13th month, and I thought the tongue-in-cheek Fortuna, Latin for luck, would be appropriate since so many people are superstitious about the number 13. What about you? What name would you pick? Thanks for the great content." First, thank you so much for writing in, Celeste. I do really like the name Fortuna. I think that's really good. I wrote back and said that I was sort of looking at Latin names for 13, and I found one place that suggested tridecim, which I also thought was fun, but I do like Fortuna, and I do really like the pointing out the fact that there would be people who would have a problem with the fact that it was the number 13 for reasons. I try to go back to for my name. I try to think of go back to my Spanish training, because I don't have any other language training except for in Spanish. And I was like, well, I couldn't remember the word for 13. I couldn't remember if it was trece or if it was dac trace, but I'm pretty sure it's trece. Okay. But I'm horrible at remembering any of that stuff, so I would go with either one of those. I think dac trace feels fun. Okay, that's fair. Very good. Well, let's end with some recommendations. Recommendations. All right, I am recommending this publishing company that everyone should know about called WND Press, which you can find at wndpress.com. They have books and podcasts and all kinds of great stuff. And I just happen to know, just out of sheer coincidence, not any particular reason, but I happen to know the founder and owner of this great company. You're so sweet. Thank you so much. We try. That's my publishing company. You're so wonderful. But no, legitimately, there's all kinds of books and stuff to get there. It's a really cool company. I strongly recommend checking it out. So that's my recommendation today. And we got a bunch of new books coming out this year too, so it's gonna be fun. Woot woot. I know, I'm so excited. So my recommendation is, first of all, thank you so much. I'm touched that you would even recommend us. So my recommendation is it's Girl Scout cookie season. Maybe at the time of this recording. I think we're there, yeah. I think we're there. I mean, I'm eating Girl Scout cookies right now, so it is. I know for sure that they are. At the time of this recording, it is, but maybe by release, it might not be. The sound you're hearing out of Shane's mouth is the sound of Shane's voice through Girl Scout cookies. Yep. There's a bunch of smacking as we go forward, just lip smacking and the worst kind of misophonia sounds that you could imagine. I'm going to recommend a new flavor. They have a new flavor this year called Adventurefuls.
And what they are, they're about the size of a $50, and they are a brownie cookie with a dollop of salted caramel in the middle of it, and then they have like fudge stripes. They're like partially dipped in chocolate with these fudge stripes, and they are so good. They are so good.
Now, if you would definitely had me if it had been a dollop of peanut butter, but that's okay. This does sound really good. Anyway, so
they are really, really good. I could put down a whole box of them. So I know it was like I was thinking the peanut butter. I was like, man, if this was peanut butter, this would be a whole different level. But it is still really, really good.
Yeah, that's still great. The caramel's great. So
yeah.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you again to Celeste for writing in. I would also like to thank the important people who help make this podcast happen. That is our Patreon supporters, which is Amanda, Kathleen, the Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, and Shauna. Thank you all so much for your continued support and helping us do what we do. But also, it's really important that I have this wonderful team of people who make my life workable, and otherwise this podcast just would not happen. And that is Justin, Shane, Shane, you and your hosting abilities. Selena, Kyle, and Alan. Selena and Alan really took the lead on putting together the research for this particular episode, so thank you guys for your work on that. And then, of course, we would not be a podcast if we didn't have people that took the time to listen to us every week. So thank you very much, listeners.
Yes.
And if you would like to tell us about your favorite historical psychological figure or your thoughts about William James or pragmatism, or if you'd like to share a publishing company or favorite cookie with us, please write in and tell us. You can reach us on social media at WWDWWD Podcast. Our email is info@wwdwwdpodcast.com by Context Media. We now have a merch store that is up and running. We currently have some mugs that are available, and we will have some shirts, and you should definitely get one of those things. It helps us out, and then it makes you look cool.
Yes, that's true. On both accounts.
Yeah. As I said at the top, if you leave us a rating and review or just a rating, those things help us as well. But I think that is all that I have. Do you have anything else, Shane?
Nope, that's all I got.
Perfect. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.